Hello everyone. Tonight we curl up in the warmest corner of Mount Olympus, the spot no thunderbolt dares strike, no god ever trashes, and no hero ever questions. It's not a battlefield or a banquet. Nope. It's Hestia's hearth, the one place even the most chaotic deity has to respect. Picture this marble columns dusted with golden pollen clouds drifting low and sleepy, and a smell in the air that's equal part cinnamon pine and whatever your grandma bakes on a snow day. You walk into Olympus expecting pomp and drama, but instead you're hit with the scent of toasted barley cakes and wood smoke. A little underwhelming, until you realize this is the heart of everything. Now, fair warning, if you ever tried to actually climb Mount Olympus between the altitude, the blizzards, and the fact that it's a literal myth, you probably wouldn't survive long enough to toast a marshmallow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, drop your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step past Zeus's thunderclouds and Athena's clanging armor, and there it is, right in the center of Olympus Hestia's hearth. No throne, no entourage, just a low stone fire circle flames flickering softly, radiating that exact kind of warmth you didn't know you needed. The air is different here, softer, slower. It's like Olympus takes a breath when you walk into her space. You sit beside the fire and realize no one's fighting here, not even Ares. In fact, the god of war is literally napping on a bearskin rug like some overgrown golden retriever. That's how powerful this place is, and that's why it smells like burnt toast. Hestia's always gently cooking something. Nothing fancy, just food that fills your soul. Bread dough puffing over coals, olives warming in a little clay dish, honey wine steaming in a copper pot. It's like your stomach says thank you before you even eat. Historically, that fire never went out. Like literally never. Every hearth in ancient Greece, every home temple and city center kept a flame going in honor of Hestia. If it died, it was bad news. Like bring out the white robes and start over from scratch kind of bad. Every time a new colony was founded, they'd carry a flame from the mother city's hearth to light the new one. That's not just tradition. That's fire as identity. Fire as citizenship. Fire as hay. Even though we're sailing across the sea to start a town next to a bunch of giant lizards, we're still Greek, okay? But Hestia's not flashy. She's not out throwing lightning bolts or starting Trojan wars. She's just there. Always warm, always steady, always smelling vaguely like cookies. And yet, most people forget she's even on Olympus. She doesn't make the tabloids. No Homeric hymns scream her name in capital letters. She never turns into a swan to seduce mortals looking at you, Zeus. She doesn't turn anyone into a spider or shout moral lessons through plagues. She just tends the fire. There's something oddly punk about that. Like in a world full of divine egos, Hestia is the quiet one who brings the casserole and leaves before the drama starts. She is no joke, the goddess of home hearth and the sacred fire, and if that sounds boring, just imagine Olympus without her. Actually, don't. Historians still argue whether she's the literal glue that holds the place together. Without her, the whole pantheon might just collapse into a flaming argument about who gets what cloud. Now, as you stretch out your legs and feel the warmth sink into your muscles, you start to see how the hearth works. This isn't just a fireplace. This is a cosmic anchor. Philosophers like Parmenides even mused that Hestia wasn't just a goddess, but the literal center of the universe. Like all the stars and galaxies, do a slow dance around her sacred glow. You tilt your head and watch the flames curl up. Maybe that's not such a crazy thought. A quirky little tidbit. Some ancient Greeks believed Hestia's fire could hear you. Not in a creepy Alexa kind of way, but in a spiritual whisper your hopes into the embers, and maybe she'll answer kind of way. If your bread didn't rise or your wine soured, maybe you forgot to say good morning to the hearth. You start to notice tiny offerings tucked beside the fire crumbs, oil drops, little clay animals. Not for show, just gratitude. And it's not just the gods who respect her. Mortals did too. Even big personalities like Pericles and Socrates. Yeah, the toga philosophers made sure to offer a pinch of food to Hestia before eating. That was just polite. Before feasts, before public meetings, even before marriages, someone would say Hestia first. And if you forgot, well, your mom would definitely give you a look. You reach out and warm your hands. There's a simplicity to it, a rhythm. Wake up, tend the fire, offer thanks, share food, repeat. It's oddly modern, like the ultimate self-care ritual disguised as ancient worship. Maybe that's what made her hearth so cozy. It wasn't just about warmth. It was about belonging. Everyone from goat herders to kings needed her. She was the goddess you didn't beg favors from. You just lived with her. And while the rest of Olympus bickered over golden apples and sea monsters, Hestia just kept that fire going. So, yeah, maybe it smells a little like burnt toast. But it also smells like peace and fresh starts and a kind of power that doesn't need to yell to be heard. You lie back, eyes half-lidded, and the last thing you hear before drifting off is the soft crackle of the eternal flame. Still burning, still waiting. You wake slowly, limbs heavy with warmth curled beside that eternal fire. Olympus hasn't changed much while you dozed. Zeus is probably still brooding on his storm throne. Hermes still zipping around looking for mischief. But here by Hestia's hearth it's still quiet, peaceful, smelling faintly of ash, wild thyme, and the kind of bread that always tastes better when someone else bakes it. It's kind of weird, honestly, how this mellow goddess kept her spot on Mount Olympus while so many others played divine musical chairs. The myths are full of newcomers and reshufflings. Dionysus pops in, someone gets banished, someone else turns into a tree. But Hestia, she stayed. Technically, she gave up her throne once to make room for that wine-loving drama magnate Dionysus, but she never truly left Olympus. She just moved closer to the fire. Of course she did. You watch her for a moment now, barefoot, wrapped in a soft wool shawl, gently stoking the embers like they're her only job in the universe. Which, in a way, they are. There's something suspiciously powerful about being that calm. And, while all the gods have their tempers, Hera can bring a city to its knees when she's annoyed, and Ares has absolutely flipped tables mid-war. Hestia's never once blown up. She doesn't throw tantrums. She doesn't curse mortals. Her power is the kind that doesn't flex, it just is. You don't notice it until it's missing. Like Wi-Fi. Or your favorite hoodie. The thing is, Hestia wasn't flashy. No epic love affairs. No monsters to slay. Just that little domestic flame she guarded like a secret. So why didn't the other gods boot her off the mountain? They totally could have. Olympus was all about status drama and loud personalities. Yet, through thousands of years of shifting mythologies and cultural rewrites, there she is sitting quietly in the middle of it all, like your introvert friend who still gets invited to every party. Because here's the truth. Hestia made Olympus work. Sure, Zeus was the king. Poseidon ruled the seas. Athena was strategy incarnate. But Hestia, she was the reason they had a place to come home to. When the gods got tired of squabbling or stomping around in mortal affairs, they'd end up right here, warming their hands, sipping something hot, maybe even talking like actual siblings for once. Historians still argue whether Hestia had real political sway or if her power was symbolic. But here's the thing without her, there is no Olympus. Literally. Every temple, every sacrifice, every divine ritual started with her. To Hestia, first wasn't just a nice phrase, it was law. You couldn't even start a public ceremony without tipping something into the fire for her. She was the opener, the anchor, the sacred reset button. And she never let it go to her head. That's probably why she stayed off the battlefield. You never see her clashing with titans or sneaking off to seduce mortals in a swan disguise. She had better things to do, like tending the flame that held the world together. The coziest goddess in the pantheon also happened to be the most stable. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. When city-states were founded in ancient Greece, they didn't just build temples or walls. They built a prytanion, a sort of communal hearth house, and lit a fire dedicated to Hestia. That fire symbolized the heart of the city. When people left to start a new colony, they'd carry a torch lit from that hearth to the new land. Forget cutting ribbons or holding press conferences. For ancient Greeks, home started with fire, and that fire had to come from her. So, no matter how far people wandered, they were still tethered to something sacred. Now imagine being that important and still being humble enough to give up your literal throne for a wine god with questionable fashion sense. That's what Hestia did. When Dionysus joined the Olympian lineup, things got a bit crowded. 12 thrones, 13 divinities. The solution, Hestia quietly stepped back. Not down, just back. She let him have the spotlight. She stayed by the fire. And of course the other gods didn't argue. Maybe because they were secretly scared of what might happen if her flame ever went out. There's a debate among scholars about whether Hestia actually disappeared from the pantheon or just changed forms over time. Some say she became more abstract, less a person, more a principle. Others insist she remained quietly essential, woven into every domestic act and sacred rite. Either way, one thing's clear, she was the still point in a spinning, ego-fueled world. The ultimate plot twist, she didn't need a throne to rule Olympus, she ruled from the hearth. It's not hard to see why the gods never kicked her out. Take her away, and the whole divine machine starts to squeak. Who's going to keep the peace? Who's going to make sure every feast starts right? Who's going to remind Apollo to wipe his feet before stepping in from the laurel grove? You stretch out your legs again, and Hestia tosses a handful of herbs into the fire sage and lavender. Maybe a bit of mint, and the scent swirls around you, calming and clean. You're not just watching history, you're inside it. Sitting at the same hearth that launched ships, soothed empires, and survived every immortal meltdown Olympus ever saw. So, no, Hestia was never kicked out. She was too necessary, too real, too quietly brilliant to lose. And here's the thing, you start to realize the real power of Olympus wasn't thunder or prophecy or golden chariots. It was the humble act of making a space warm, safe, and sacred. That's Hestia's legacy. A goddess who ruled not by force, but by flame. The hearth glows low now, thick with golden embers and dancing shadows. You shift slightly, and the stones beneath you are warm, like they remember every conversation, every quiet moment of peace ever shared here. The fire's been burning for so long, it doesn't even flicker when you move it, just hums steady and soft. You lean in, watching the flames twist and curl like they're whispering secrets in a language you almost remember. That's when it really hits you. This fire doesn't go out. Ever. Not at night. Not in storms. Not even when the gods themselves vanish from memory and their temples crumble into tourist traps. Hestia's flame endures. That's because her fire isn't just fire. It's sacred. In ancient Greece, keeping the household hearth burning was more than a chore, it was a spiritual obligation. That fire wasn't just for cooking your lentil stew or warming your feet, it was literally your family's link to the gods. If the fire died, it was like severing a divine hotline. You had to perform a full-on purification ritual. Beg forgiveness. Relight it from a public flame and maybe sacrifice a goat or at least a little wine to make amends. And if you think that sounds intense, imagine being the person responsible for the city's eternal flame. That was a full-time job often held by officials or priestesses. If that fire went out, oof. You weren't just in trouble with your neighbors, you might be blamed for inviting famine war or an embarrassing lack of olives. In fact, in some places, if someone intentionally let the flame die, they could be exiled. Bye-bye citizenship. Hope you like sleeping outside the city walls with the wild boars. There's a fringe theory that the ancient Greeks believed Hestia's fire was a living entity. Not metaphorically, actually alive. Like you could anger it, please it, whisper to it. Some even thought it had moods. A stubborn flame meant your home had bad energy. A cheerful dancing one, Hestia, was pleased. You probably wouldn't catch modern fire marshals endorsing this idea, but still, it makes you look at your own fireplace a little differently. Huh? And here's a historical fact that feels almost unreal in ancient Athens. The Prytanean, or city hearth, was so important that if the city was conquered or rebuilt, the flame had to be re-established before anything else. Forget the walls or temples. First the fire, then the city. Without Hestia's flame, you didn't have a home, you just had buildings. You think back to the myths, the wild ones, the ones where gods throw fits and mortals get turned into pine trees, and you start to realize something. Through it all, Hestia's flame was still there. When Zeus overthrew Kronos, when Pandora opened her jar, when Prometheus brought fire to mankind and got his liver pecked out for it, Hestia's hearth kept glowing. Even when humanity messed things up epically, which, let's face it, we did often, the hearth stayed lit. Now, here's something historians still argue about, whether Hestia's fire was borrowed from older traditions, or if she was the origin of fire worship in the ancient Mediterranean. Some say she was a late addition, a sort of personification of rituals already in place. Others argue she was always there, the quiet heartbeat beneath every chant and sacrifice. Either way, she ended up being the one deity you couldn't skip, forget, or outgrow. You poke gently at the fire with a stick because even on Olympus, fire poking is irresistible, and watch a little cluster of sparks leap upward. They remind you of stars, tiny and endless. And maybe that's the point. Hestia's flame wasn't dramatic because it didn't need to be. It was the constant, the thing that held everything else together. Here's a random but oddly comforting fact. Ancient Greek brides would carry a flame from their mother's hearth to their new home after marriage. No registry, no Instagram-worthy cake, just fire borrowed and passed on a thread of warmth connecting generations. That was how homes began, through flame, through Hestia. There's a kind of beauty in that simplicity. No crashing cymbals, no divine ultimatums. Just a woman with a lamp walking into the future. And in that sense, Hestia's power is wild. Not loud, wild, quiet, wild. The kind of influence that doesn't scream but still shapes the world. 1,000,000 homes lit with her fire. 1,000,000 meals shared in her name. 1,000,000 whispered prayers over flickering coals. You look around the hearth again, and there's a subtle detail you hadn't noticed before. The stones around the fire pit are worn smooth, not by magic, but by time, by the backs of gods and mortals who've sat here for millennia. It's the divine equivalent of your favorite couch cushion. And at the center, still glowing, is Hestia's fire. A small golden promise that no matter what chaos erupts outside this spot will always be safe. And you're not the only one who thinks so. In some lesser-known myths, Hestia was the one god who everyone trusted. She was the tiebreaker, the peacemaker, the one you'd go to when everyone else was throwing thunderbolts. There's a reason they say she never fought, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. That's strength. Honestly, if the other gods had followed her lead just once in a while, maybe we wouldn't have had quite so many oaths, broken cities burned, and swans acting sketchy. As you breathe in the scent of warm ashes and roasted grain, you realize you've stopped thinking of Hestia as a background character. She's the reason you feel safe here. She's the reason Olympus has any chill at all. And that's what eternal fire is, right. Not just something to cook with, but something to trust. So you lean back once more, letting the glow wash over your face, and the last thought that drifts through your head is a simple one. She kept the fire going, and that changed everything. You stretch your toes toward the fire, and the warmth moves through you like honey. Not too hot, not too bright, just right. If perfection had a temperature, this would be it. You glance over at Hestia again. She's sitting cross-legged, her gaze soft and a little amused, like she just remembered a joke but isn't ready to share it yet. You want to ask her something big, like why she doesn't get more credit, why she's the goddess of the hearth instead of, say, the cosmos. But before you can open your mouth, the fire answers for her. It crackles quietly, tossing a little pine sap into the air with a satisfying pop. And you get it. Because this isn't about fame. This is about home. Which brings us to a key part of her legend, her role in every single home in Greece. See, while the other gods had their flashy temples and public festivals, Hestia didn't need any of that. Every private household had a hearth dedicated to her. Every meal cooked was an offering. Every fire lit in the morning was a prayer. You could go your whole life without visiting a temple of Apollo, but you couldn't live a single day without crossing paths with Hestia. She was there in the bread, baking in the clay oven. In the embers someone stirred before sunrise. In the stew pot that bubbled while families told stories. She didn't need marble pillars or gold leaf altars. Her temple was your kitchen. It's strange how something so ordinary could be so sacred. Even when cities were at war, Athens throwing shade at Sparta, Thebes, getting a little too full of itself, Hestia remained neutral, untouched. Both sides prayed to her. Both kept her flame. That's how deep her roots ran. No matter your politics, your grudges, your big, dumb war helmets, everyone needed fire. And here's a fascinating historical fact: in the Roman world, Hestia didn't disappear. She just got a name change, Vesta. And the Romans loved her, possibly even more than the Greeks. They built an entire temple to her in the Roman Forum, guarded 24/7 by the famous Vestal Virgins. These priestesses weren't just fire babysitters. They were some of the most powerful women in Rome, trusted with state secrets, and treated with serious respect if also very intense rules. Like no dating, and don't let the fire go out, or you'll be buried alive. You know minor stuff. Scholars still debate whether the Vestal Virgins were a feminist win, or a weird mix of empowerment and control. On the one hand, they were legally independent in a society that rarely allowed women that status. On the other, their lives were completely devoted to a job with some truly terrifying job performance reviews. Drop the flame oops, that's national disaster territory. Hope you enjoyed your final meal. And yet, they did it. For over 1,000 years. That's how important the hearth was. Back on Olympus, Hestia was never the one making headlines, but she was always the one making sure the lights stayed on. While Artemis was out hunting Athena plotting and Aphrodite stirring up drama, Hestia kept things grounded. Literally. Her sacred fire wasn't just a symbol, it was believed to be the actual Earth's center. The Omphalos stone at Delphi. That was connected to her too, the belly button of the world, warmed by her. Which brings us to another quirky tidbit. Some ancient Greeks believed that the world itself had a hearth at its core, a divine flame that kept everything spinning, and that flame was Hestia. Not metaphorically. Actually. It's one of those ideas that sounds fringe now, but back then it was poetry and science and faith all rolled into one cozy theory. And when you think about it, it tracks. The center of the home, the center of the city, the center of the earth. Wherever you needed grounding, she was there. Unmoving. Unshakable. That's why she never got dragged into divine gossip. Not once did Hestia turn someone into a flower chase a mortal through the woods, or launch 100 ships over a love triangle. No, she was too busy keeping the world from falling apart. She made neutrality look noble. And here's the strange part in ancient Greek storytelling. Hestia has almost no major myths. No dramatic love affairs. No world-shaking betrayals. Just stillness. Presence. She's like gravity. Always there shaping everything, even if you don't write epic poems about her. Historians still argue about why this is. Some say it's because she was too sacred to fictionalize. Others believe her worship predates even the Olympian pantheon, that she might have been a pre-Hellenic goddess woven into new stories after the fact. Whatever the reason, her mythic silence is kind of beautiful. She doesn't need a saga. She is the setting for every saga. You glance into the fire again and see movement. Not flames this time, but memories. A mother handing her daughter a piece of bread. A soldier kneeling at the hearth before leaving for war. A priestess, tired but devoted, coaxing the morning fire back to life. It's all there, past and present, glowing together. And maybe that's the lesson Hestia keeps whispering to those who listen. Not every hero fights. Not every god needs thunder. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay still. Keep the light going. Make a place where others can return. You wiggle your toes again, feeling their edges tingle. The fire's steady rhythm is syncing with your breath now. Inhale, glow. Exhale, crackle. You're not just watching Hestia's flame. You're becoming part of it. Warm, quiet, eternal. The embers pulse like a heartbeat now, slow, steady calm. You pull the blanket tighter, settling a little deeper into your seat by the fire. Around you, Olympus stretches into the starry distance, its edges softened by heat, shimmer, and myth. But right here, in the golden radius of the hearth, it all feels close. Touchable. Human. It's strange how something so divine could feel so ordinary. That's the thing with Hestia. She's the only Olympian who never had a single throne dispute. Not once did she scheme or demand worship. In fact, she gave up her throne voluntarily when Dionysus arrived. Can you imagine that happening at any corporate office today? Someone slides in late and says, "Hey, we're one chair short," and you go, "Sure, I'll just stand forever." Yeah. No. But that's what she did. And she wasn't booted out either. She chose it, gave up her seat at the table of 12 so there'd be room for the wine god, the actual, literal party crasher. Talk about knowing your worth. Historians still argue whether this part of the myth is symbolic or just a polite narrative workaround for the Greek obsession with the number 12. But even if it's symbolic, it's powerful. Hestia steps back from the spotlight, not because she's less important, but because she knows she doesn't need to be seen to matter. She is without question the anti-drama goddess. And let's be real, Olympus needed one of those. You look around and imagine the 12 other gods bickering in full divine soap opera mode. Zeus thundering over something petty. Hera glaring daggers Apollo trying to start an acoustic set in the corner. Artemis rolling her eyes into next week. Meanwhile, Hestia's just tending the fire. Listening. Making sure the baklava doesn't burn. Classic. Now, this quiet act of self-removal, it made her even more sacred. The Greeks didn't forget her because she wasn't on a throne, they honored her first. In every sacrifice, a portion went to Hestia before any other god, before Zeus, before Athena, before Poseidon. Even when he was in one of his, look at me, I'm the ocean moods. Here's a historical nugget for you in both public and private rituals. It was customary to begin and end with Hestia. You literally couldn't have a ceremony without her. She was the opening note and the final bow, which kind of makes her the original theme music of ancient life. And while we're on quirky traditions, some homes in rural Greece still whisper a short prayer to Hestia before relighting a fire. It's not part of any official modern religion, just a passed-down habit. A ritual without rules, like muscle memory across generations. Think about that. Thousands of years later, people still feel the need to speak to her before striking a match. That's not mythology. That's legacy. And it isn't just homes. Cities had hearths too big public ones. In the Prytaneion, remember that from earlier, the city's eternal flame represented unity and continuity. If you moved away to start a new colony, you didn't just pack food and tools. You took flame from the city hearth. Like High New World, we brought some democracy and fire. It's hard to imagine anything like that today. No one's smuggling a toaster oven out of their hometown to make sure the suburbs feel connected. But back then, this wasn't just symbolic. It was spiritual glue, a glowing thread between past and future. There's something kind of sci-fi about it, isn't there? Carrying fire across oceans like a living signal, like a spark that says, we were here, we mattered, we brought warmth. And yet, Hestia's role has always been less about fireworks and more about holding space. Not claiming it, not weaponizing it, just holding it. Like an empty chair at a family table, always waiting, always ready. It's this kind of energy that probably made her the one Olympian no one dared to insult. There are no myths of mortals trying to trick her. No revenge stories. No angry curses or doomed lovers. That's unheard of. In a pantheon where pride was constantly bruised and people were always being turned into spiders' trees or stone statues, Hestia was untouchable. Not because she threatened anyone, but because insulting her would be like insulting bread, or grandmothers, or naps. Just fundamentally wrong. Scholars still puzzle over why she was depicted so rarely in art and sculpture. Was it because she was too sacred to portray, or because her vibe was too subtle for marble? You can chisel Zeus mid-lightning bolt or Aphrodite rising from sea foam. But how do you carve warm domestic stability? How do you turn stillness into a statue? Maybe that's why her sacred symbols were so simple: the flame, the circle, sometimes a kettle. Things that are whole, centered, complete. And speaking of symbols, the circle really is everything for Hestia. Think about it. The hearth is round. The city hearth is round. Her temples, when she had them, were circular, unlike the rectangular ones for other gods. The circle has no beginning, no end. It's quiet infinity, kind of like the vibe she gives off. Eternal, but never showy. There's a theory, some call it fringe, others call it genius, that Hestia represents the human need for repetition, for rhythm, for the rituals that give life shape. Wake up, tend the fire. Make food, tell stories, sleep. Repeat, not because it's boring, but because it's safe, predictable, comforting, and that's why her absence would be terrifying. Imagine a world without Hestia. Fires gone cold, no light in the center, meals silent, cities disconnected. You can't build anything in a world like that. Not really. You look back into the hearth now and it seems a little brighter, like it's listening, like it knows you understand. And maybe that's the secret behind her strength. She doesn't shout to be heard. She whispers, and the world listens anyway. So you shift your weight, feeling the smooth stone beneath you, and let your eyes soften as the fire crackles on. Around you, Olympus feels quieter now. Not lonely, just calm, held. And for a moment you don't feel like a visitor anymore. You feel like you belong. The fire hisses gently, like it's sighing in its sleep. The warmth curls around you like a sleepy cat, brushing your arms, your cheeks, the tips of your ears. Hestia hasn't moved. She doesn't need to. Her very stillness is the movement, steady, constant, glowing. You shift slightly on your seat and your thoughts drift to something that's been humming under the surface this whole time, the difference between flame and chaos. Every other Olympian has their signature drama, Poseidon thrashing oceans in a fit, Ares, throwing temper tantrums with swords, Zeus, being Zeus. But Hestia, she's the fire that doesn't burn the house down. And somehow that's rarer than we like to admit. Her flame is order. It's the cinnamon-scented control at the heart of a raucous household, the part of civilization that keeps things from descending into mayhem. When you light a candle during a storm, when you bake cookies at midnight just to feel okay again, that's her. And trust me, she knows how much you need her when the world is spinning too fast. Back in ancient Greece, the hearth wasn't just a convenience. It was a lifeline. Homes were built around it, not the other way around. The fire wasn't in the kitchen was wherever the fire was, and it was never left to die. Even when people left for festivals, someone stayed behind to tend it. That little flicker wasn't just heat, it was identity. If the fire went out, you didn't just relight it with a shrug. You performed purification rites, sometimes fetched new flame from the city hearth. It was that serious. Mainstream fact, in Athens, the public hearth was located in the Prytaneum, and its eternal flame was considered the symbolic soul of the city. And if you founded a new settlement, you took a piece of that original flame with you, literally carrying the spirit of the old home into the new one. A spark in your pocket like a glowing tether. It's kind of poetic when you think about it. Every fire you start links you to the one before, like nesting dolls of warmth stretching back through time. And it wasn't just metaphorical. We've found archaeological evidence of central hearths being meticulously maintained, sometimes with grooves in the floor, from generations of people sitting beside them. That kind of erosion only happens with time, with presence, with memory. Scholars still argue whether these grooves were intentional design features or just the slow wear of repeated rituals, kneeling, turning, stirring. Either way, it's oddly moving. Proof of lives lived in circles, of people who showed up day after day, not to conquer or invent or proclaim, but just to tend. That's the heart of Hestia, the goddess of showing up. Not for the crowd, for the moment. You lean forward now, feeling the fire's breath on your skin, and let your thoughts wander to another quiet corner of her mythology, the oaths taken in her name. See, in the ancient world, swearing by Hestia meant something. People didn't do it casually. This wasn't a by Zeus sort of dramatic exclamation. This was solemn, binding. Swearing on the hearth was swearing on your ancestors, your house, your soul. It was the original, you break it, you buy it. In fact, it was considered a sacred offense to lie after invoking Hestia. If you did, well, the gods might not throw a lightning bolt, but you'd feel it. In your crops, in your sleep, in the silence of a fire that wouldn't light. There's a fringe theory, one of those delightfully speculative ones, that Hestia's fire wasn't just a metaphor for conscience, but a literal feedback loop. That, if you lied with her flame present, it knew, it remembered. The same way bread burns when you're not in the right headspace. Or how soup never boils when you're watching it. Maybe it wasn't superstition. Maybe it was relationship. Because Hestia doesn't demand belief. She invites trust. And in the chaos of mythology that made her radical. Imagine the bravery it takes to be gentle on a mountain full of thunder gods. To choose quiet when everyone else is yelling. To be the sanctuary while others build monuments to themselves. And yet Hestia wasn't isolated. That's the part that people miss. She wasn't a hermit goddess sitting alone with her fire while the others partied. She was the center of every gathering. Think about that. In Greek households, the hearth wasn't in a separate room. It was in the middle. Meals happened around it. Stories were told beside it. Newborns were introduced to it. The dead were honored near it. Everything began and ended with that fire. It made her both deeply personal and universally public. The friend and the foundation. You didn't just worship her, you lived with her. Even today you feel that legacy. Not in temples, but in the instinct to light a candle on a hard day. In the calm that comes from stirring soup. In the hush of a family gathered around a flickering screen, warm drinks in hand, even if the fire is now digital. Hestia adapted. She always does. That's why she survived longer than most gods, not in names, but in habits. In the way we still crave center, still seek quiet, still try to make something feel like home. There's a lovely detail from a lesser-known festival, the Anthesteria, which honored Dionysus, yes, our party god again, where the kitchen hearth was briefly transformed into a little altar. Not for wine, but for grounding. It was a moment where even celebration made space for stillness, where joy and rest shared the same room. Historians still puzzle over how festivals like that balanced chaos and calm, but maybe that's the secret. You can have both. You just need someone to hold the center. You glance at Hestia again. Her face is unreadable, as always. But something in the fire's rhythm tells you she's glad you've noticed, that you're listening, that maybe you too are learning to hold space. So you lean back the stone, warm against your spine, the air thick with comfort, and you let the moment stretch. No need to rush. Hestia's not going anywhere. She never does. The fire's rhythm lulls you now, soft snaps and whispers like a warm lullaby written in flame. You don't even notice how your breathing matches it. Slow, even, safe, and beside you still and luminous Hestia. She doesn't say much. She never has to. The hearth does the talking for her. You blink slowly, and your mind drifts not to temples or thrones, but to kitchens. Real ones. Small, cluttered human ones. Maybe you've seen it someone's grandmother stirring soup with a wooden spoon so old it's practically an heirloom. Or a late-night pizza run that turns into a whole conversation around a microwave. Doesn't matter if it's ancient Greece or your cousin's studio apartment, every home has a hearth whether it looks like one or not. That's Hestia's real power. She doesn't demand gold-plated altars or 50-foot statues. She thrives in burnt toast, mismatched mugs, and late-night leftovers. Anywhere people gather with food and stories, she shows up. Quiet, smiling. Mainstream history tells us this sense of domestic sacredness was embedded into Greek life. In fact, every new household established in ancient Greece began with a fire taken either from the bride's family hearth or the city's central flame. Not just a romantic gesture, but a literal spiritual handoff, a continuity of flame linking lives like beads on a necklace. Imagine that getting married and having a chunk of your childhood fire scooped into a clay container and marched across town to your new home. No pressure. And it wasn't only marriages. If a home was built or rebuilt, if something devastating happened, say the fire accidentally went out, or a tragedy struck, rites of purification had to be performed before the flame could be restored. Not just a box to check. A sacred restart button. Historians still argue whether these purification rites were strictly religious or had early public health functions, especially in places with high fire risk. Either way, the flame wasn't just heat. It was identity. You didn't just light a fire. You invited it. There's even this delightfully fringe tidbit from a minor philosopher you probably haven't heard of him, and that's okay, who claimed that each family's hearth had a memory, not in the magical talking flame kind of way, but in a slow, absorbing sense. Like the soot in the chimney held your family's arguments, laughter, and recipes. That if you sat close enough, you could feel the history radiating back out at you. Honestly, it's hard to disagree. Haven't you ever stood in an old kitchen and just felt something? Like the walls remember the pancakes from 10 years ago. Like the stove sighs every time someone fries eggs. That's Hestia's realm, not just heat, but emotional memory baked right into the space. And because she's not flashy, she's often underestimated. Most school books skim over her. You probably got one paragraph tops, just enough to say, Goddess of the Hearth, not much drama, moving on. But Hestia's absence in the myths isn't a lack of substance, it's a refusal to perform. She doesn't need grand narratives or lovers turned into laurel trees. She's not here for the gossip. She's here for the quiet, for the long game. It's why, out of all the Olympians, she's the most trusted. Not just in rituals, but emotionally. People leaned on her. Literal sailors would bring offerings to her before setting sail, not Poseidon, not Athena, because they wanted to return home. Hestia was the end goal. The light in the window. And get this, in some fragments of ancient poetry, people actually compare her to the breath of the house. Like she's what makes a home alive. Without her, it's just walls. You breathe in now a little deeper, like you're testing that theory. Still breathing. Then she's here. And she's not just the breath. She's the pause. The space between conversations. the silence that isn't awkward but comforting. That moment when no one's speaking and you all know this is it. This is peace. You don't find many gods who embody that. Most are about action, war, wisdom, wind, wine. Movement, change, flash. Hestia, though. She's about being still without being stagnant. That's not easy. Try sitting still in a chair for 10 minutes without checking your phone. Go on, I'll wait. Tough, right? That's why she's powerful. Not because she controls nature or fate, but because she governs the one thing people crave most: belonging. In a world full of motion, she stays. You picture ancient Greece again, not the temples, but the homes. Mud brick walls, woven mats, the smell of olive oil and smoke. In every single one, a hearth, usually modest, sometimes little more than a stone-lined pit, but always tended, always respected. You didn't throw trash in it. You didn't curse in front of it. It was a place of warmth, yes, but also of memory of presence. And that meant Hestia. There's even a custom from some mountain villages still practiced into the modern era, where children are taught to greet the hearth each morning. Just a soft good day sometimes, with a little bow. Not out of fear, out of thanks, out of ritual. And you sitting here now, wrapped in this ancient warmth, feel it too. Not fear, not awe. Just thanks. You might not have bowed to your microwave this morning, but maybe you noticed the steam curling from your mug. Maybe you paused before lighting a candle. Maybe you cleaned your kitchen counter and felt better for it. That's her. She doesn't need her name carved into stone. She lives in muscle memory, in instinct, in the way we still circle around things: campfires, kitchen islands, video calls, without even realizing we're recreating the hearth. And she'll wait. That's the other thing. No matter how long you're gone, no matter how far you wander, Hestia's always there. No guilt, no grand entrance, just warmth. Just welcome back. I saved your spot. You shift your weight again, and the stone is warmer now. Like it's holding you. Like it's been holding everyone who ever needed to feel safe. That's the thing about Hestia. She doesn't make the fire about herself. She makes it about you. You stretch your legs a little, and the firelight flickers across your toes. Warmth rises soft and steady like a slow exhale from the mountain itself. Hestia is still there beside you, motionless, serene, and somehow more present than ever. You get the feeling she could sit like that for 1,000 years and not mind a bit. Because Hestia plays the long game. Where most gods explode onto the scene with backstories full of lightning bolts and scandal. Hestia's myth is all about endurance. She was the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, yes, the very first Olympian. And in a rather stomach-turning family tradition, she was also the first to be swallowed whole by dear old Dad. You remember that bit, right? Cronus gulping down his children like some kind of divine competitive eater. Delightful. But here's the twist: because she was first in, she was also last out. That's right, when Zeus finally made Cronus barf, everyone back up. Hestia emerged last, which, depending on how you look at it, made her both the first and last born of the Olympians. A neat little paradox, the Alpha and the Omega. Very on-brand for a goddess who embodies cycles and returns. Historians still argue whether that peculiar bit of myth was meant to symbolize rebirth, or just ancient poets getting a little too clever with timelines. Either way, it gave Hestia a strange kind of authority, quiet but absolute. She was there first, and she'll be there last. And honestly, you believe it. She has that vibe. But here's where it gets interesting. After all that swallowing and unswallowing drama, When the Olympians finally started divvying up power, who gets the sea, who gets the sky, who gets to yell the most, Hestia had a choice. She could have demanded a throne like the others. She had the seniority. She had the bloodline. She had every right to claim a dominion. Instead, she stepped back. She looked around at the squabbling and the pride and the power grabs, and she said, "You know what, I'm good." And she gave up her seat, voluntarily. She ceded her throne to Dionysus, the new guy. Mr. Wine and Wild Parties, the drama magnate. He wanted in, and rather than let things spiral into yet another Olympian family feud, Hestia bowed out. She chose the hearth over the throne. Let that sink in. In a pantheon defined by egos the size of Mount Olympus, she gave up power in favor of peace. There's a mainstream scholarly consensus that this act made her unique among the 12 Olympians, technically putting her in and out of the group depending on which myth you read. Some lists include her, some don't. But she didn't vanish. Oh no, she just moved locations. From the marble throne room to the fireside. From the spotlight to the soul of every home. And let's be real, that's where the power lives. Because here's the truth, no one likes to admit thrones are temporary. Fires endure. You feel that, don't you? The steadiness of her choice. The kind of strength it takes to not fight for status. To say, I'll tend the center. You all can orbit around me if you like. You glance over at her, and maybe you catch a faint smile playing on her lips. The kind that says you're starting to get it. But don't mistake her calm for passivity. Giving up the throne didn't make her less powerful. If anything, it made her untouchable. No rivalries, no scandals, no Trojan Wars started in her name. She stepped out of the drama and became the one place everyone could go. And they did go. Every sacrificial offering in the ancient world began with her. Before you could honor Zeus or Artemis or Apollo, you first honored Hestia. A splash of wine, a pinch of grain into the fire. Because without her there was no ritual, no sanctity, no home for the gods in the mortal world. There's a wonderfully weird historical tidbit about early Athenian politics bear. With me, I promise it's more fun than it sounds, where the city itself was seen as an extension of the hearth. The Prytaneum, remember that from earlier, it was both a civic building and a sacred space. Its hearth burned constantly, and it was where ambassadors were welcomed, treaties were signed, and orphans were sometimes cared for. Basically, if you were standing in the Prytaneum, you were standing in Hestia's living room. And she welcomed everyone. That was her rule. You didn't need to be powerful or pure or even polite. If you came in peace and needed rest, the hearth was for you. No questions asked. That radical hospitality, that was her. Historians still debate whether Hestia had temples of her own. Some say she did, others say her worship was too woven into daily life to need separate buildings. But either way, it's clear she didn't want walls between herself and her people. Her temple was the home, the inn, the flame in the center of every town. Even the traveling flame used for founding new colonies. Yeah, that was called the sacred fire of Hestia. It was transported in bronze containers glowing like a miniature sun. It made every new city an extension of her warmth. Like Google Maps, but for divine presence. You can almost see it now, flickers of flame spreading across the Mediterranean like constellations made of kindling. Every one of them a promise, a place to return to. So, as you sit there beside her on this impossibly timeless mountainside, you start to realize something strange. Maybe it's not that she gave up her throne. Maybe she simply redefined what power looks like. Not gold, not glory, but warmth, space, presence, the kind of power that waits, that watches, that whispers you're safe now. And just like that, the fire sighs again. A curl of smoke spirals upward. You feel it drift into your bones, and you know she's still holding the center. The night deepens and the firelight dances slower now, its golden fingers swaying like lullabies on stone. You're sunk low into the heat and hush, barely blinking, barely moving. Hestia hasn't moved either, not in the dramatic way. But somehow she feels closer than ever. The stillness around her presses in like a blanket, fresh from the dryer. Familiar, quiet, absolute. There's something uncanny about sitting beside someone whose power doesn't require performance. No thunder, no tridents, no war cries, just being. And somehow that's enough. You let your gaze wander from the hearth and out toward Olympus itself. The sky here doesn't behave like mortal sky. The stars seem closer. The clouds glide like silk. And scattered across the slopes are hints of other homes, other hearths. A shepherd's light. A flicker from a temple window. Maybe even a cook fire halfway up the mountain. All of them distant cousins to this fire. Because while the gods bickered over temples and territory, Hestia laid claim to something no one else thought to protect the space between. She became the goddess of home. And not in the white picket fence kind of way, but in the soul-deep, bones-settling, take-off-your-shoes-and-sigh kind of way. That feeling when you open your door after a long trip. When your dog practically explodes with joy. When you wear pajama pants for 16 hours and no one questions it. That's Hestia's domain. And if that seems too ordinary for a goddess, good. She wanted it that way. It's easy to forget how radical that is. Gods, especially Olympians, weren't exactly known for their humility. Poseidon flooded cities out of spite. Hera turned rivals into cows. Athena turned that one guy into an owl, or, wait, was it a spider? Doesn't matter. The point is, they were dramatic. Hestia, though. She leaned into the quiet, into ritual, into the slow, steady heartbeat of daily life. You stir slightly as the fire shifts, and it reminds you of something oddly specific, lighting a candle for no reason. Just because. Maybe it smells like cinnamon or sea salt. Maybe it makes your room feel less lonely. That tiny ritual. That's her. Mainstream historical sources tell us that in every Greek home, the hearth wasn't just a fireplace. It was a sacred site, a literal altar. You didn't just cook there, you prayed there, made offerings there, started and ended the day there. Kids would place their first teeth by the hearth. Families would whisper their grief and their hopes into its flames. And if you're wondering, did that really matter? Or was it just habit? The answer is yes. Historians still argue whether hearth rituals were truly personal spiritual acts or just cultural repetition passed down like recipes. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it doesn't matter why the ritual existed. Maybe what matters is that it gave people something to anchor to. You feel that too, don't you? In moments when the world tilts sideways, maybe it's grief, maybe it's joy, maybe it's just a weird Tuesday. You reach for something small, something ritual, a cup of tea, a walk around the block, a playlist you've heard 100 times. Hestia isn't in the grandeur, she's in the grounding. Even when the rest of Olympus was literally on fire wars, monsters' prophecies gone haywire, people knew they could turn to her. She was a constant, like gravity, like the scent of soup on a rainy day. There's a fringe theory from one folklorist, definitely, someone who wore a lot of wool and never got invited to symposiums, who suggested Hestia's worship might have influenced early monastic practices. Think about it. Silence, stability, daily ritual, welcoming all who come in peace. Sounds suspiciously like a nunnery. Or maybe just a really nice Airbnb. But this idea that Hestia's hearth was a kind of proto-temple has legs. Some of the earliest monasteries were built with central gathering fires. No pulpits, no grand sermons, just warmth and stillness. The kind of space where people breathe again. And that's really what she does best, create space. Even in mythology, Hestia is rarely in the stories. But she's the reason they happen. Because no hero sets out without a home to leave. And no journey feels complete without someone waiting by the fire when you return. You remember Odysseus, right? 10 years of war. 10 more years of wandering. And what does he want more than anything? Not another victory. Not another trophy. Just to sit at his own hearth again. To feel Penelope's presence. To exist quietly in the space he left behind. That yearning, that's Hestia. You stretch your arms overhead and yawn the motion pulling at something warm in your chest. That's the thing about her. She doesn't just guard the home. She creates the feeling of home inside you. Portable, durable, permanent. You can carry that kind of fire through anything. And while we're at it, let's talk about the actual fire. The physics of it. Because sure, it's easy to get poetic about flames, but there's real magic in the science too. A hearth fire, especially in older Greek homes, wasn't just a pile of sticks. It was a carefully tended balance. The hearths were often circular, symbolizing unity, and built with stone that held heat long after the flames died down. You'd bank coals overnight to save fire for the next morning. You'd feed it at dawn like a living thing. And you didn't just throw wood on randomly, you learned how to stack it. How to listen to it. You had a relationship with your fire. And the same way modern chefs swear their cast iron skillets have personalities, ancient families treated their hearths like trusted elders. They fed it, cleaned it, kept it company. You didn't just turn it off. You said good night. You chuckle quietly. Imagine doing that with your electric stove. Good night, GE profile. Sweet dreams. But hey, maybe we should. Because what Hestia reminds us of again and again is that sacredness isn't about location. It's about attention. Intention. That moment when you pause, breathe in, and choose to be present. So, the next time you light a candle, heat some leftovers, or just curl up in the glow of your screen, remember her. Not as a distant goddess perched on a mountaintop, but as the whisper in your kitchen. The hum in your radiator. The glow you forgot you needed until it wrapped around you like an old song. She's never far. Just look for the light. You lean in, not out of cold, but something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or that strange pull we feel toward things that don't demand our attention, but still hold it completely. Hestia's flame hasn't gotten any brighter, and yet it feels like it's illuminating more and more. Not the room, not Olympus, but you. You can almost feel it, mapping the soft edges of your thoughts. The fire crackles, a pop, a hiss, and then stillness again. Here's the strange part about Hestia, despite her absence from most myths, despite rarely being painted on vases or carved into temples, she might have been the most present goddess in everyday life. Which is wild, right? You'd think omnipresence would go to someone flashier. But that's kind of her secret. She's like the background music you don't notice until it stops, and then suddenly the silence is unbearable. You shift your weight and something in the stones beneath you gives just slightly as if to say, yes. Keep going. So let's talk about her presence. Because this isn't just poetic fluff, Hestia was literally invoked first and last in every major ritual. Whether you were sacrificing a bull, starting a feast, or even signing a treaty, you poured out the first drop of wine to Hestia. Before anyone else. Zeus included. Big guy had to wait his turn. And that meant something. It meant everything began with her. That flame symbolized order, belonging, protection. You didn't just throw a party, you made it sacred by honoring the hearth. Mainstream scholars point out that this wasn't just superstition, it was infrastructure. Fire was central to survival. No hearth meant no cooked food, no heat, no purification. And by personifying the hearth, the Greeks gave themselves a ritual framework to maintain those essentials. In other words, Hestia wasn't just comfort, she was continuity. But, you know, what's kind of deliciously ironic? She's the only major Olympian who didn't move. She never left Olympus for epic battles, underworld rescue missions, or casual monster slaying. Hestia stayed put, right in the center, and yet she was everywhere. Her presence rippled out from every hearth, every fire, every place that called itself home. Fringe mythologists. Yes, those exist. And yes, they're as fun as they sound like to argue that Hestia may have predated the Olympians entirely, that she's a holdover from pre-Hellenic fire cults. The kind of deity who wasn't invented for drama but discovered in necessity. Firekeepers, mostly women who sang to the flames and passed embers in sacred pots across mountain trails. It tracks. She doesn't behave like the others because she isn't like the others. She's older, quieter, maybe even wiser. Historians still argue whether Hestia's sidelining in popular myth was a sign of cultural transition or just a storytelling blind spot. After all, war stories sell better than peace. But even if the poets ignored her, the people didn't. You can skip a story, but you don't skip lighting the fire. You exhale, and your breath turns visible in the cool night air. The contrast is satisfying chill in your lungs, warmth at your side. There's something undeniably real about being near fire. Screens can mimic it. Candles can echo it. But only a true flame carries that primal weight. The flicker that says, you're alive. You're not alone. And Hestia, she's that flicker made divine. But let's zoom in a bit past the grand myths and city hearths to the human level. The tiny rituals. The everyday. Imagine you're a kid in ancient Athens. You wake up to the smell of barley bread and a hearth still warm from the night before. Your mother sprinkles a bit of oil into the coals, murmuring a prayer to Hestia as she stirs the ashes. Your grandfather sits nearby, sharpening a tool, humming an old melody. And before anyone eats, they toss a crumb into the fire. It's not fancy, it's not formal, but it's sacred. And when you grow up and move out, you don't just build a house, you start a hearth. Literally, from fire carried from your family's home, or the city's central flame. You don't begin with furniture. You begin with her. There's something heartbreakingly beautiful about that. Before Wi-Fi passwords and moving boxes and endless trips to IKEA, ancient Greeks lit a fire. They called it Hestia. And they said, now we live here. Even newlywed couples had a ritual with her. The bride would light a fire in her new home with coals from her parents' hearth, symbolizing continuity and warmth. It's like the ancient version of something borrowed, but a lot hotter. And when someone died, they'd place a small offering on the hearth in their honor. A final warmth before they were sent to rest. Life began and ended at the fire. You blink slowly, feeling your heartbeat mirror the rhythm of the flames. Everything in Hestia's orbit moves with purpose, even stillness. She makes time feel thick, stretchable, like saltwater taffy pulled between your fingers. It's easy to think of power as loud, sharp, urgent. But Hestia's power is in the pause, in the breath before the storm, in the cup of tea handed to a friend who doesn't have the words yet. You glance over again. She hasn't moved, doesn't need to. The whole mountain shifts around her. You wonder if you asked her for advice what she'd say. Not in riddles, not in declarations. Just something simple, soft. Like, be the place others come back to. Or maybe let your warmth speak for you. Or maybe she wouldn't say anything at all. Just add a log to the fire and wait. You settle deeper into the glow, knowing now what kind of goddess she really is. The kind who doesn't chase attention. The kind who earns it. The fire burns low now, but not weak. It hums like a lullaby content with its own warmth. You're wrapped in that glow, a little sleepy, but not quite ready to close your eyes. Hestia's presence isn't sharp, it doesn't poke or prod. It just is, like gravity, or the smell of cookies when someone bakes 3 floors down. You don't know where it comes from exactly, but you're grateful for it. So you let your thoughts drift sideways again, back to the heart of the matter, Hestia's hearth. Not just her symbol, but her entire identity. A space where warmth isn't a luxury, it's a right. A space where being still is powerful. Where silence is sacred, not awkward. You might be thinking, okay, but didn't the Greeks have like 1,000,000 gods for 1,000,000 things? Why did this one quiet, calm Hestia get so much respect? And it's a fair question. After all, this is a pantheon where people turned into trees, cows got divine punishment, and someone literally birthed a goddess from their forehead. But Hestia wasn't respected in spite of her simplicity, she was revered because of it. In fact, she was offered one of the highest honors in all of Olympus, the first portion of every sacrifice. That's like getting first pick at Thanksgiving every time. Even Zeus didn't object. No lightning bolts, no petty drama. Just an understanding Hestia comes first. And it wasn't just a rule, it was a comfort. Because when chaos reigned, and if you've read literally any Greek myth, you know it rained, often she was the still point. The ground under your feet, the buttered toast after a long day. You picture the city of Delphi, not the shiny temple part, but the glowing hearth in the Prytaneon, the town hall. Every polis had one. That central hearth wasn't just for show. It was sacred. It held the eternal flame of the city tended by appointed guardians. That fire wasn't allowed to die. If it did, bad omen. Like your phone dying at 3% with no charger in sight but for your entire city-state. Mainstream historians agree that these civic hearths represented more than religious reverence, they were literal power centers. The hearth's flame was tied to the identity of the polis. When colonists set off to found a new city, they carried embers from the mother city's hearth. That's like packing your Wi-Fi router to go start a new civilization, or sending your hometown's warmth along for the ride. It wasn't just symbolic, it was the connection. Old home to new, past to future. And there's something undeniably poetic about carrying fire like that. No torches, no wild flames, just glowing coals in a bronze pot swaddled in wool. A spark of civilization wrapped like a baby cradled across mountains and seas. That's Hestia's legacy. Quiet, smoldering, impossible to ignore. Now, fringe scholars, those quirky, myth-loving rebels in cardigans, sometimes suggest that this whole first and last ritual tied to Hestia might not have been just symbolic. There's a theory that the offering to her acted as a psychological reset for the community, like a collective deep breath before the real business began, a way to center everyone before stepping into the unknown. Historians still argue whether the first offering rule was universally enforced or just a regional custom that grew mythic over time. But you know what? Even if it was just a story, people lived by it, and sometimes that's more powerful than truth. You shift slightly your back against the smooth stone. Your eyes trace the line of firelight as it dances across the ceiling. Hestia's domain isn't loud, but it lingers. She doesn't ask you to believe. She invites you to feel. And it's not just ancient Greece that held on to this image. The Roman Empire brought her across the Mediterranean with a new name, Vesta, and a whole fleet of fire-tending priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. These women were hand-picked sacred and terrifyingly important. Their job, keep the flame burning. Always. If the fire went out, that wasn't just a whoops. It was a national crisis. People believed Rome would fall if Vesta's flame died. And maybe that sounds extreme, but think about how we panic when our Wi-Fi drops. Now scale that up to an empire. The Vestals were given privileges that most Roman women couldn't even dream of: political protection, social power, the ability to own property. But the cost was steep. Celibacy, constant duty, ritual perfection. All for the fire. You wonder what it must have felt like living inside a temple where stillness was power. No battles, no ceremonies to win favor from a fickle god. Just flame. Constant. Sacred. You blink slowly, imagining it. White robes. Quiet footsteps. A room humming with the heat of divine expectation. And somehow, even there, Hestia wouldn't be judging. She wouldn't loom or glare. She'd just be there. Warm. Watching. Endless. That's the thing. Whether it's a flicker in a kitchen or a roaring blaze in a temple, the hearth represents something deeper presence. Not performance. Not productivity. Just presence. And that's radical. In a world obsessed with motion conquests, battles, goals even now with hustle culture and 5-year plans, Hestia says, be still. Stay warm. Protect your space. That's enough. You let that settle. Like ash in the fire. It reminds you of that one friend who doesn't text much, but when they do, it's something real. Or the favorite corner of your room where the sunlight hits just right. Or that stretch of road you always take the long way home just to drive. You didn't realize how much you needed that until you sat beside Hestia. The flame's a little lower now, softer, but steady, always steady. And somehow that steadiness makes you feel like maybe everything's going to be okay. You're still by the fire toes, warmed, thoughts softened. The hush of Olympus curls around your ears like a woolen blanket, and the air smells faintly of thyme and old stone. You're not in a palace tonight. You're in a kind of quiet pocket. A space held not by walls, but by warmth. And just as your breathing syncs with the rhythm of the flames, your mind drifts again to how Hestia turned the hearth into something more than physical. Something metaphysical, emotional, maybe even political. Because here's the secret, Hestia wasn't just the goddess of the hearth. She was the goddess of belonging. You may have noticed it already. Her flame isn't about flash. It's about foundation. The structure you build your life around. The first thing lit when a family forms. The last thing extinguished when it ends. Not because the fire matters, but because what it represents does. Take the Greek oikos, for instance. That word gets translated as household, but it really means something bigger. Your whole little universe. Your family, your possessions, your slaves. Yeah, ancient Greece had those reality check your property and even your domestic gods. And right smack in the middle of it all, the hearth. Hestia. She was the oikos. She was what made it a whole. Historians still argue whether the hearth's centrality was more religious or functional. But let's be real, it was both. You could not have a home without fire. That would be like calling a Wi-Fi cafe connected without any signal. Just cold, empty space and a lot of awkward silence. And for women, Hestia was everything. She wasn't just a goddess to be honored, she was a model. The ideal of the domestic sphere. Quiet, faithful, stable. Of course, this has a flip side. Some scholars point out that Hestia's perfection might have boxed women into narrow roles, always keeping the fire, always staying put, never storming Olympus. But here's a fringe theory that's way more fun. What if Hestia chose her stillness? What if she turned down marriage to Poseidon and Apollo? Not because she was shy, but because she was powerful. Because she didn't want to be consumed by someone else's story. She made a vow of eternal virginity, remember? And Zeus, not exactly a paragon of consent, respected it. Which is saying a lot. No temple takeovers. No cosmic punishments. He just nodded, handed her a central seat, and said, "Cool. You stay here. Keep things together." And she did. For eons. So maybe Hestia isn't a symbol of female submission. Maybe she's a quiet rebellion, a divine reminder that choosing home doesn't mean giving up power, it means redefining it. You glance at the fire again. It hasn't moved, but it feels like it has. It's shifted, deepened, like it heard that thought and nodded slightly. And here's something odd but true: she had no throne. Every other Olympian thrones galore. Golden chairs, ivory accents, dramatic backrests that screamed, "Look at me, I'm important," but Hestia. She gave hers up, offered it to Dionysus the party god, a total vibe shift. Historians still argue whether this was a literal swap or a symbolic gesture. Did Hestia really leave the 12-seat lineup, or did she just make space? Either way, she stayed in Olympus. She stayed central. She just didn't need a throne to prove it. You know someone like that, don't you? The person who hosts the party makes sure everyone's fed, but never demands attention. The one who doesn't post every meal on social, but you feel them in every bite. That's Hestia. She's the hostess, the anchor, the reason the space feels whole. In ancient homes, the hearth was also the spiritual center. Offerings were made there, sure, but it also acted like a hotline to the gods. No need for a mountain trek or a temple pilgrimage. Just kneel by the fire, whisper into the smoke, and trust Hestia to relay the message. Fringe tidbit time. Some obscure rituals included tossing bits of hair into the hearth during transitions like puberty, marriage, or moving out. Hair into the fire, symbolizing transformation. A bit dramatic, sure, but also kind of poetic. Burn the old you, step into the new. And here's where it gets even deeper. Hestia wasn't just in houses, she was in cities too. The central fire of the Prytaneon, that eternal civic hearth we talked about, it wasn't just a symbol of statehood. It was a promise that no matter what chaos raged outside the city walls, there would always be a place of peace within them. And when disasters struck, plague, war, famine, the hearth became a beacon, a literal and emotional lighthouse. People gathered around it, not just to eat or warm their hands, but to remember who they were. You let that sink in. You think about your own hearths, whatever form they take. Maybe it's your grandmother's kitchen. Maybe it's the first apartment where you felt safe. Maybe it's a person, a pet, a playlist. The idea isn't the fire, It's the feeling, the returning, the knowing you have somewhere to go. And that's the magic. Hestia didn't lead with fear, or seduction, or thunderbolts. She led with welcome. She says, "Come in. I've been waiting. The tea's warm. The world can wait." She says, "You don't have to prove anything here. Just be." You didn't know a goddess could do that. You do now. And the longer you sit here, the more you start to think maybe power isn't always in the lightning, or the sword, or the throne. Maybe it's in the glow. You stretch a little where you sit. The stone floor warmed just enough to keep you anchored, like the hearth knows you're not quite ready to drift into dreams. The fire crackles softly, a secret language spoken in pops and flickers. You're still with Hestia, and she's still with you. Quiet, unbothered, like the last light left on in the house, so you never feel alone. Tonight, you find yourself wondering how exactly did Hestia keep her cool when every other Olympian seemed allergic to peace? I mean, this was a divine family that made most soap operas look like structured conflict resolution workshops. Yet there she was, never storming off, never throwing a wine cup, never shape-shifting out of spite, just tending the flame. That restraint wasn't just personality, it was strategy. You see, Hestia's role in Olympus wasn't passive, it was diplomatic. She kept the center grounded so the outer madness wouldn't crack the foundation. That was her gift, emotional gravity. Without her, Olympus would have spun off its axis ages ago. Think of her as the divine mediator only, instead of hosting intervention circles she fed. You gave you a seat and let the warmth of the hearth soften your temper. Scholars often overlook this, but fringe academics, those charmingly obsessed with the nuances, suggest that Hestia's silence wasn't just serenity. It was tactical absence, a refusal to escalate, a divine act of de-escalation. In fact, when the gods squabbled, where did they gather around the hearth? Hestia didn't pick sides. She was the side everyone returned to. Like when your group of friends argues and someone eventually says, "Let's just go to Jenna's house. She has snacks and blankets." That's Hestia. Except Jenna glows softly and channels eternal cosmic equilibrium. And not to overstate things, but her influence shaped the way ancient hospitality worked. Enter Xenia, a code of guest friendship sacred in Greek culture. Think of it as divine-level Airbnb etiquette. Hosts were expected to provide food, shelter, and protection. Guests were expected not to trash the place or hex the dog. And, overseeing it all, Zeus technically. But who actually did the hosting part? Hestia. The hearth was where travelers were welcomed. Meals were cooked there, feet were warmed there, and stories were told there. The fire wasn't just for heat, it was an extension of the host's spirit. To tend your hearth well was to care for your guest deeply. And offending a guest under your roof, big mistake. Mythologically, massive mistake. Remember Odysseus, dude took years to get home, but every step of the way Xenia was the measure of who could be trusted. And while Zeus upheld the law, Hestia was the feeling behind it. The soul of the custom. Historians still argue whether this reverence for hearth-based hospitality was a domestic ideal or a deeply political tool. After all, who you welcomed and how you treated them could sway alliances, build networks, or start feuds. But regardless of motive, the hearth never lied. It was a living witness to what kind of person or god you really were. And here's a curious, slightly overlooked detail in some ancient rites. Embers from the family hearth were used to ignite torches for weddings. The symbolism. You're taking a piece of the home you grew up in and using it to light the future you're walking into. That hits, doesn't it? Like passing down not just flame, but memory, legacy, warmth encoded in ritual, fringe tidbit. In certain rural regions of Greece, long after the classical gods had faded, people still kept a place in the kitchen for Hestia under different names with different prayers, but the idea remained. A small shrine, a flickering flame, maybe just a candle. The last god to be let go, they say, is the one who made you feel at home. And that leads you to something else, something big. When Christianity began sweeping through the Roman Empire, many of the old gods were cast aside with almost theatrical disdain. Temples were shut down, statues smashed, rituals outlawed. But guess whose cult took the longest to fade? That's right, Hestia. Or rather, Vesta, her Roman counterpart. The fire in the Temple of Vesta burned in Rome for over 1,000 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. Let that simmer for a second. One flame, 1,000 years, tended day and night by the Vestal virgins who were more like state officials than religious acolytes. They had legal power, political immunity, and ceremonial clout. If a prisoner happened to cross paths with one on the way to execution, pardoned on the spot. That's how sacred Hestia's presence was, even by proxy. And when that temple flame was finally extinguished in 391 CE, it marked not just the end of a religion, but the end of an era, a tangible, smoky moment where the ancient world exhaled for the last time. You can still visit the ruins today. A few columns, the curve of a foundation, a plaque that whispers more than it shouts. But the fire gone. Or maybe not. Maybe it lives on in every home-cooked meal, every reunion hug, every soft place you return to after the world's been too loud. Because that's the legacy Hestia left behind, not temples, not battles, not epic quests. Just warmth. Just home. And in a way, maybe that's the greatest power of all. Not demanding loyalty, but earning it. Not conquering hearts, but comforting them. Not being the loudest in the room, but being the one everyone turns to when they need to remember who they are. You lean a little closer to the fire now. It responds with a gentle crackle like it's saying, "Still here, still here, still sacred." And somehow, so are you. The fire's steady rhythm continues an almost imperceptible heartbeat at the center of Olympus. Your eyes trace the curl of a flame that dances without ever leaving its place, just like her. Hestia. She's not interested in battles or ceremonies or statues carved with perfect cheekbones. She's interested in the things that stay warm after the story ends. Tonight, you're thinking about how her hearth was never confined to one place. You've already visited the Prytaneum, that grand civic hearth at the heart of every Greek city. But it turns out there was another fire always burning quietly right there in the middle of you. Well, not you personally, unless you've recently founded a colony in the ancient Aegean. But ancient Greeks. They didn't just start cities. They carried Hestia's flame with them to do it. Literally. Imagine it, a group of colonists sets sail leaving behind their homeland to found a new settlement. Alongside the grain tools and probably a reluctant goat or two, they take with them sacred fire embers from the original city's hearth. They protect it, guard it from wind and water, and once they arrive in the new land, they use it to light the new city's hearth. That's how important continuity was. It wasn't a colony until Hestia was lit. Historians still argue whether this ritual was rooted more in superstition or statecraft. Was it divine legitimacy, or just a poetic way to say, yeah, this counts as real now? Probably both. After all, nothing says official like sacred fire with bureaucratic undertones. But what's fascinating is how fire so chaotic, so wild, becomes a symbol of stability under Hestia. No other element gets that treatment. Water slippery, wind moody, earth. Sure, it's solid until an earthquake throws a tantrum, but fire is wild and loyal if you tend it. It's almost like Hestia teaches you that the things worth having, the things that warm and sustain you, require effort. You have to feed the flame. You have to show up. You can't just light it and walk away. And that's where the metaphor gets personal. Because your own life, your relationships, your purpose, your peace, all hearths, all fires that depend on presence and patience. And just like the ancient Greeks carried embers across seas, maybe you're carrying your own pieces of home memories, rituals, even a favorite mug into every new chapter. Fringe tidbit. In some later texts, Hestia becomes a kind of spiritual hitchhiker, not in a creepy way, more like an invisible companion who follows wherever there's fire, peace, and a bit of bread. It's why some ancient sailors swore they felt her presence when they lit their galley stoves far from shore. Not Poseidon, not Athena, Hestia, the feeling of home even at sea. And if you're wondering how she balanced all this responsibility, here's a curious little debate that never quite gets settled. Did Hestia actually travel to Earth? You hear tales of other gods descending in disguise, Zeus turning into bulls, Hermes sneaking around with wings on his shoes. But Hestia, she rarely, if ever, leaves Olympus. Scholars disagree about whether this is due to her function. She is the hearth, after all, kind of hard to relocate a fireplace, or if it's a deeper metaphor for constancy. She's not the wandering type. She's the anchor, the one who holds the divine fort, while the rest of them go gallivanting. But even without setting foot on earth, she's everywhere. Every fire, every prayer murmured in kitchens, every peace treaty signed over shared bread and wine, she's there. She doesn't need grand entrances. She doesn't need to prove anything. That's kind of her whole point. And let's talk about food. Because Hestia isn't just the goddess of fire. She's the goddess of the meal, the shared table, the cooking, the serving, the act of sitting down together with people you love, or at least tolerate, and saying, "This matters." You probably don't think much about your stovetop. It's just there. But to the ancients, the hearth was a holy place. Meals were sacrifices in miniature, and offering the first bite to Hestia standard protocol, a way of saying thank you, of acknowledging that the meal, the heat that cooked it, the space you're in, all of it exists, because something or someone is keeping the world in balance. So, the next time you scrape burnt cheese off a baking dish, think of it as a humble devotional practice. Slightly smoky, but sacred. And while we're in the kitchen, here's a delightful historical nugget. Some households didn't just cook with their hearth, they used it to interpret the gods' moods. Yes, the ancient Greek version of checking your horoscope might involve watching how your stew bubbled, or whether your logs cracked at just the right moment. A loud pop. Good omen. A sudden sputter. Maybe don't go on that trip tomorrow. Modern scientists would roll their eyes. But who hasn't made life choices based on toast landing, butter side down? And again, we return to the theme. Hestia isn't about grand miracles. She's about patterns, repetition, the quiet trust that the sun will rise, the bread will rise, and the family will rise from sleep to gather again. And speaking of families, her flame also played a central role in birth rituals. When a child was born, the father would walk the newborn around the hearth formally, introducing them to the household gods, especially Hestia. This was the moment the child became officially part of the family. Before that, technically, still under review. But after the hearth circuit, you're in. That's the magic of it. The fire welcomes you. It doesn't ask your GPA or tax bracket or social standing. It just says, "Here, have a seat. You're one of us now." And that might be the real reason Hestia's flame gets carried protected, honored. Because it holds identity, continuity, soul. Not the kind of soul you can define in textbooks. The kind that exists when the room quiets the tea steeps and someone says, "Tell me how your day really was." Hestia lives in those moments, and lucky for you, she never leaves. The flame flickers once more, then settles back into its rhythm. You don't move. Not yet. There's still more warmth to uncover. The light from the hearth doesn't just warm your skin. It seems to fold around your bones a familiar heaviness that isn't weariness exactly, just stillness. It's like being wrapped in the last quilt your grandmother ever made. Frayed in places, but stitched with stories. Tonight, your thoughts drift to something less tangible but just as important ritual. The way Hestia's flame didn't just sit there flickering, it structured time. Marked beginnings and endings. Created sacred boundaries between chaos and comfort. You might not think of ritual as thrilling content, no minotaurs, no lightning bolts, but trust me, the Olympians would have imploded without it. And at the heart of so many rituals, there she is again. Hestia. Quiet. Necessary. Never the headliner, but always on the program. Let's start with the most fundamental moment in any ancient Greek home, lighting the hearth for the first time. This wasn't just some flint and tinder chore, it was the foundational act of creating a household. Often tied to marriage, childbirth, or moving into a new home, kindling, Hestia's flame meant the house was officially alive. The newlyweds, they'd light the hearth as part of their union. That wasn't just a romantic, Instagram-worthy fire pit moment. It was a literal invocation of divine presence. Hestia was the third being in the marriage minus the weird jealousy issues. She brought stability, stew, sanity, and that first fire. It wasn't random. Often it came from a relative's hearth or a communal altar symbolizing lineage and connection. The flame said, "We're not floating in the void. We're part of something older and warmer." Mainstream historians highlight this as a central step in oikonomia, the household order that defined classical society. But fringe thinkers, always ready to stir the cauldron, argue that this ritual gave women subtle but crucial control. After all, who ran the hearth, who managed the meals, the family ceremonies, the rhythms of daily sacrifice? Yep, Hestia's earthly avatars, women. There's even debate about whether priestesses of Hestia in certain towns held informal sway over civic decisions. Because if you control the fire, you control the gatherings. You control where people sit. You control who gets fed. And let's be honest, you definitely control the vibe. Speaking of vibe, let's zoom out to the city scale again. Remember the Prytanean, that central hearth in every Greek polis. It wasn't just symbolic. It was the site of public ritual feasting, and yes, diplomatic wooing. Imagine envoys from rival cities gathering around a state-sanctioned fire, breaking bread while eyeing each other warily. And Hestia's flame flickering between them, quietly suggesting, "Let's not poison each other tonight." In fact, during major festivals, communal meals were held in her honor right there in the Prytanean. These weren't wild Dionysian bacchanals. This was food as fellowship, fire as social glue, fringe tidbit. Some records suggest that cities used the flame to reset their civic calendars. If things got too chaotic, Say a war or political scandal reconsecrating the hearth could symbolically reboot the city. It was like turning your society off and on again. The divine IT department, courtesy of Hestia. And you know what really stands out? She didn't need drama to matter. In a pantheon of gods with trust issues and epic grudges, Hestia's domain was humble repetition, lighting the fire every morning, offering the first and last drops of wine, wrapping the day in a soft little ritual bow. There's something revolutionary about that, especially in a culture obsessed with glory and fame. Hestia didn't want monuments, she wanted maintenance. Not conquest, but continuity. Not flash, but rhythm. And this isn't just theory. Her role in public sacrifice shows it perfectly. In nearly every major Greek ritual, whether to Apollo Athena or the occasional obscure river god, the first and last offering always went to Hestia. She wasn't the purpose of the sacrifice, but she was the permission, the guardian of the process. Without her blessing, nothing else flowed right. She was the ritual's reset button and its seal of completion. Beginning and end, ashes and flame. And that's kind of gorgeous, because while everyone else was out chasing epicness, Hestia quietly claimed the liminal spaces, the thresholds, the moments in between. And let's talk about those thresholds. In ancient Greek homes, the hearth wasn't usually front and center. Like in a Norman Rockwell painting, it was often near the center of the house, but subtly placed. Yet, symbolically, it radiated outward, protecting the doorways, the boundaries of what was considered home. There were rituals for crossing thresholds, too. Guests stepped over with care. Newborns were carried across. Brides entered their husbands' homes with their eyes down and the flame in their heart. And in all of it, Hestia lingered. Historians still argue whether she was meant to be more guardian or more guide. But maybe she was both. Maybe that's the point of fire. It watches and it warms. It protects and it invites. It tells you where you belong and where not to tread. So, what happens when the hearth goes dark? That wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a cosmic one. A dark hearth meant disorder, illness, emotional entropy. In some households, if the flame died unexpectedly, the entire home underwent ritual cleansing. Because if Hestia's flame left you, something must have gone deeply wrong. And yet there was always a way back. That's maybe the most comforting part of her story. Hestia doesn't punish. She doesn't disappear in a vengeful hiss. If your hearth goes cold, she waits for you to relight it. No drama, just patience. Like an old friend who always leaves the porch light on. So, here you are, still sitting by that ever-steady flame. And maybe now you realize this whole story, it's a ritual too. One sentence offered, one pause observed. A gentle act of attention, of presence. No sacrifices required. Just showing up. Just breathing in the warmth. Hestia would approve. You're still here. Still with the flame. And the way it flickers now, it's almost like it's listening to your thoughts. You ever get that feeling? Like something ancient is tuning in, not with ears, but with warmth. You shift slightly, the kind of movement that makes blankets rustle and dreams hover just out of reach. And as your eyes soften into the firelight, your mind begins to wander this time to the people who kept Hestia's flame alive. Because while gods may be eternal, hearths are not. They require tending. They need human hands, real breath, a schedule. And in temples across the Greek world, those hands belonged to women sworn to a life of watching the flame. Enter the priestesses of Hestia. Now, there's some scholarly side-eyeing here. Unlike the famously chaste Vestal virgins of Rome, who were basically Hestia's cousins in white linen ancient Greek priestesses, weren't always bound by celibacy or strict rules. In fact, historians still argue whether Hestia even had official temple priestesses in most city-states. Some say she didn't need them. Others point to subtle inscriptions and records that hint at quiet women doing quiet work, and being quietly powerful for it. But there's one place where the caretakers of Hestia were absolutely official Delphi. That's right, the same Delphi with the oracle, the cryptic prophecies, the laurel leaves, and confusing poetic riddles. Hidden within all that mystic fog was a humble, ever-burning hearth in the Prytanean, and it was someone's job to keep it alive. You probably think it was all incense and solemn chants, but let's be real. It was probably more like a shift job with sacred perks. Keeping the fire going wasn't glamorous. It meant waking early, watching logs dwindle, knowing the rhythm of smoke. And it meant knowing when to call the community together, when to bless, when to pause. And the person doing that. Often a woman past the chaos of early adulthood. Not married, or no longer married. Someone who understood that constancy wasn't boring, it was sacred. Here's the quirky tidbit of the night. In some rural towns, the role of Hestia's attendant rotated between households. Every family took turns hosting the flame for a set number of days, kind of like sacred babysitting. There were feasts, hymns, and, yes, judging. Because heaven forbid you let the hearth go smoky on your watch. Nothing like divine social pressure to keep the logs perfectly arranged. And if you think the fire never traveled, think again. During certain ceremonies, the sacred flame was carried not in open torches like some dramatic movie montage, but in covered lamps, sometimes cradled in clay pots, swaddled like a baby. The symbolism was clear. This wasn't just heat. This was heritage. One particularly touching ritual. When a city suffered disaster fire plague war, the community would extinguish their hearths, purify them, and relight them using fire from Delphi. A kind of divine reset button. Forget 404 errors. This was like reinstalling sacred software from Olympus's main server. But even in its quietness, this act of tending a flame carried weight. Remember, this wasn't a world of electric stoves or push-button heat. Fire was life. It boiled your water, baked your bread, banished shadows, and in some cases kept angry spirits at bay. So, if you were chosen to keep that flame alive, you mattered. You weren't just background staff, you were holding society's soul. It's funny, isn't it, that the person doing the least flashy work could have the most enduring impact. That a woman tending logs and ash, whispering prayers while everyone else chased omens and glory, was anchoring the whole spiritual infrastructure. In a way, she was Hestia, or at least her voice on earth. And what do we learn from this? That constancy is its own form of courage. Because tending a hearth is not about dramatic change. It's not about revelation or reinvention. It's about showing up, again and again, even when no one's watching, especially then. Think of your own life, your routines, the morning cup of tea, the way you double-check the door before bed. These aren't trivial, they're how you build your own little temple of sanity in a chaotic world. Every repetition is a tiny prayer to Hestia. And if your routines feel meaningless sometimes, that's okay. Sacred things often do. Until one day you realize they were scaffolding all along quiet support beams holding your world in place. Historians still puzzle over how such an important deity left so little fanfare. No grand temples dedicated solely to her. No great myths of vengeance or heroic deeds. But maybe that's the point. Hestia wasn't about spectacle. she was about essence. You don't see gravity, but it's there. You don't hear the heartbeat of your home, but it's beating. And as you return to that flickering hearth in your mind, the one you've now carried through storms, feasts, festivals, and rituals, you realize something else: the fire doesn't burn because it wants to be admired. It burns because it's supposed to, because someone keeps feeding it. So tonight, let that someone be you, not with logs or olive oil, but with stillness, with presence, with one deep breath taken simply because you can. No priestess robes required, just you, listening to the hush between flames, keeping a very old promise alive. You wake in the middle of the night, not all the way, just enough to shift your blanket and blink into the warmth. The fire hasn't gone out. Of course it hasn't. You'd notice. You'd feel it. The hush of the hearth is still there, purring against the walls of your mind, like a cat you forgot you adopted. By now, you've sat with Hestia through so many parts of her world: the divine backstory, the rituals, the priestesses, but you haven't yet eaten with her. Which is a bit rude, honestly. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth, and the hearth was the kitchen before kitchens had tile backsplashes and Pinterest boards. So, yes, she was a food goddess too. Not in the wild, indulgent way of Dionysus or the grain-worshipping vibe of Demeter, but in the daily bread way. The literal bread, actually. Picture this: you wake in a small Greek village around 500 BCE. Your house is stone square and smells like olive oil and smoke. Before the sun fully rises, your mother or your grandmother has already bent over the hearth, coaxing life from yesterday's embers. There's no coffee machine, just warm ash, a whisper of flame, and hands that know exactly where to feed it. Soon, flatbreads hit the griddle. Maybe there's goat cheese, maybe a drizzle of honey. It's not a feast, it's continuity. A sacred breakfast, not because it's elaborate, but because it's made on Hestia's altar. And yes, the hearth is an altar. That's a real thing. Any food cooked there was touched by the divine. Mainstream historians call the hearth the sacred center of domestic life. But let's break that down into taste and texture. Every bite shared by that fire carried a little blessing, ritual or not. Because cooking wasn't just sustenance, it was connection. Meals were how families remembered who they were, which cousin they didn't talk to, which god got the best bite. And let me tell you a delightful fringe tidbit: some families believed Hestia actually tasted their offerings before anyone else. Not just the burnt bits left as sacrifice, but the real food, the good stuff. So the first portion of stew poured into the fire. A splash of wine onto the hearthstone. The toastiest bit of bread given, not eaten. One Greek poet even joked that Hestia had the best diet on Olympus, a menu of everyone's first and finest. Imagine being honored with the crispy cheese edge of every pie. Not bad for someone who never left home. And speaking of pies, let's talk about panis, ancient round loaves that were often decorated with simple patterns before baking. These weren't just bakery flair, they were symbolic. Circles for eternity. Dots and spirals for family. And sometimes, yes, little phallic shapes for fertility because, well, ancient Greece. Hestia's hearth, you see, was also tied to generative energy. Quietly, discreetly. No need for orgies, just a bubbling lentil pot and some laughter. And food wasn't just for the living. Remember earlier when we talked about hearths guarding thresholds, that includes the threshold between life and death. During certain festivals, like the Anthisteria families offered cooked meals at the hearth, not just for Hestia, but for wandering spirits. Think Day of the Dead, but spookier and with more olives. Historians still argue whether these ghostly guests were believed to physically consume the offerings or merely absorb the steam, the essence. Either way, it was Hestia who mediated the moment, keeping spirits fed and families safe. Flame as firewall. Hospitality extended across the veil, and that's the word we need to sit with: hospitality. In Greek culture, hospitality wasn't just good manners, it was law. Xenia, sacred guest friendship. Zeus enforced it, sure, but Hestia enabled it. Because you can't host someone without warmth, without food, without a space to sit and feel safe. So, even if she didn't write the guest list, Hestia made sure there were enough chairs. And this comes full circle, literally, to her association with the hearth's physical shape. Most hearths were circular. So were loaves. So were communal tables. Roundness in Hestia's world was not just aesthetic, it was philosophy. No corners to isolate. No ends to dominate. Just equal shared presence. In fact, there's an old saying from a rural mountain village passed down so many times, no one remembers the original source. You don't argue around Hestia's fire. Not because it's forbidden, but because it's impossible. The warmth evens people out. The food softens the edge of words. Quirky bit. Some communities had a custom where if a family argument got too intense, someone would silently drop a handful of flour into the fire. That was the signal. Dispute over. Hestia had heard enough. No need for yelling, just puff and peace. So, next time your group chat gets spicy, consider the flower move. Ancient wisdom, modern problem solving. But don't get the idea that Hestia's hearth was only for the elite or the pious. It belonged to everyone. Rich or poor, Greek or foreigner. You crossed a threshold into someone's home. Their fire was yours. Some traveling poets even wrote verses to Hestia before dinner in strangers' houses, not just to flatter the host, but because they genuinely believed the flame was listening. That it mattered to thank her. That hospitality itself was an act of worship. And that's the flavor of her magic. Nothing flashy, nothing explosive, just warmth extended, food shared, space made sacred through attention. And maybe you're starting to feel it now, that flicker inside you. Not a literal fire, but the echo of one. The hunger that isn't about hunger. The craving for presence, for safety, for something soft and warm and offered without conditions. You're not alone in that. You never were. Because in every meal you've shared, every cup of cocoa handed across a tired counter, every midnight snack in a friend's kitchen, Hestia's there. Not judging your microwave popcorn. Just glad you're feeding someone. Maybe even yourself. So tonight, as the scent of imagined bread lingers, as your breath evens, and your thoughts drift toward quieter corners, let this moment be its own offering. You've listened, you've learned, you've kept the flame company. And if you're feeling full in your heart now, not just your stomach, that's not an accident. That's Hestia's gift. Your eyes are half-lidded now, the kind of slow blink that's less about seeing and more about feeling the space around you. The fire hasn't dimmed, but it's softer somehow. Not weaker, just quieter. Like it knows it's time to speak in whispers. And tonight, as you lean in just a bit closer, we're stepping into the glow of something more abstract. Something both ancient and oddly modern. Because we've talked about gods and hearths, rituals and loaves, but what about home? What makes it more than just walls and a roof? What makes a place sacred even if it's tiny, cluttered, or occasionally smells like burnt toast? It's Hestia, but not in the mythological hovering deity sense. No, this is deeper than that. This is Hestia as the spirit of presence, of stillness, of anchoring energy. She is the atmosphere that makes a space feel safe. She's why you breathe out differently when you walk through your door. Why the lights in your bedroom don't need to be fancy to feel kind. Historians still argue whether ancient Greeks truly believed in the gods as literal beings or just used them to symbolize big ideas. But with Hestia, the line blurs, because everyone knew what she represented even if they didn't carve her into statues or dedicate festivals to her very often. She wasn't seen, she was felt, and that's the crux of it. Hestia was never a spectacle. She was the silence that held everything else. Imagine being the center of the Greek universe not metaphorically, but physically. In every town, the Prytaneion sat at the heart of the civic space. Inside it, a fire. Hestia's fire. Always lit. Always tended. It burned through wars and treaties, weddings and executions. A flame that outlived kings. Now think about your own center. Not a public square, but the invisible compass you carry inside you. The thing that always points toward safe, toward known. Some people call it their gut. Others call it their breath. Maybe for you it's a certain chair or the smell of your favorite book or the buzz of your cat's purr. That's Hestia. She's not a goddess in the sky, she's the heartbeat in your routine. Let's go fringe for a moment. There's a minor philosophical theory only ever referenced in one dusty scroll that claimed Hestia didn't live on Mount Olympus. She was Mount Olympus. Not as in a giant stone woman chilling under the snowcaps, but as the spiritual hearth of the gods themselves. The gravity holding their chaos in balance. No thunderbolts, no wine-induced scandals, just the quiet gravitational pull of home base. Which, if you've been keeping track, makes total sense, because every pantheon needs its anchor. And Hestia. She never left hers. Even when the rest of Olympus bickered, paired off, or caused mortals to turn into trees, she stayed by the flame. Consistent, watchful, and not in a control-freak way, more like a lighthouse. There, if you needed her. Not hurt if you didn't. You ever notice that? How some people make a space feel calm the moment they walk into it? That's Hestia energy. She doesn't need to lead the conversation. She just is, and in that being, things soften, which makes her rare, and also underrated. In fact, here's a mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. Hestia was once one of the original 12 Olympians. But at some point, depending on which version you follow, she willingly gave up her seat to Dionysus. Wine god, party boy, human disco ball. She didn't fight it, didn't file a complaint, just stepped back with the same grace she always carried and returned to the fire. That's the myth anyway. And again, historians still debate whether this giving up her seat story was a late addition to explain why she's often left out of lists of major gods. But it tracks, doesn't it? The one who doesn't need attention is the one who gets left off the invites, but still hosts the gathering anyway. That's the paradox of Hestia. She's everywhere and nowhere. At the start of every ritual, but never the main event. Her name is whispered before wine is poured, before prayers are made, before journeys begin. And then she fades into the background. A friend once joked that Hestia would be the type to clean up after the party before it's even over, and you wouldn't notice until you looked down and realized someone had already washed your plate. She's that kind of presence. Invisible, but absolutely essential. And maybe you've felt it when you return to your childhood home and the doorknob still fits your hand exactly. When you light a candle on a rainy evening, just because. When you sit in silence with someone and it's not awkward at all. It's easy to think that fire is just about warmth. But Hestia's fire was more than that. It was focus. It was presence distilled. A soft, flickering invitation to be here now. That's rare in a world of constant motion. Even back then, chariots instead of traffic, yes, but still full of noise. Hestia didn't need to do anything new to stay relevant. She just needed to be the same, over and over, an eternal loop of calm. So, if your life feels scattered sometimes, or loud, or like every god in your Olympus is making demands, remember that you too can tend a fire. It doesn't need to be literal. It could be your bedtime ritual, your 5-minute journal, the way you line up your pens, just so. Tiny flames. Repetition as reverence. And when you forget. When you stumble into chaos or fall out of rhythm, she's still there, waiting. Because the hearth isn't just a place. It's a promise. And once you've lit it, it never truly goes out. You're drifting now. Not quite asleep, not fully awake. Just nestled in that cozy twilight where thoughts move like smoke and the fire hums somewhere just beneath your ribs. This is where Hestia really shines. Not in grand temples or epic poems, but in these quiet in-betweens where the line between the sacred and the everyday gets delightfully blurry. Tonight, we're slipping deeper into the underlayer of her power. Not just the symbolism of the hearth, but its secret alchemy. How something as simple as a fire at the center of a home became the engine behind cities, states, and entire civilizations. Let's start small. In ancient Greece, when a new colony was founded, settlers would journey with a flame carried from the hearth of their mother city. Literally, they'd bring a burning ember kept alive in a bronze container all the way across the sea. Why? Because this fire was home. It was the soul of the old city, still glowing in their hands, ready to light the spirit of the new. And once they arrived, that same flame kindled the hearth of the new Prytanian, the public hearth, so that even though the geography had changed, the essence hadn't. Hestia had traveled with them. She always did. Mainstream historians point to this ritual as a way of maintaining civic identity, a kind of cultural continuity. And sure, that's true. But it was also a way to keep the ancestors close. You weren't just building a new market or a fresh set of city walls, you were building with memory. Even more poetically, if the fire went out during travel, it was considered a dire omen. Some communities would turn back completely or postpone founding until a fresh ember could be retrieved. No flame. No start. No exceptions. Now, fringe alert, there's a rare story mentioned only in one minor oracle text about a colony that didn't carry its ember properly. Their flame fizzled on the journey. They restarted with matches or well flint, and things went terribly. Crop failures, infighting, petty theft of amphorae. The oracle allegedly said the flame was false, and so the walls cannot stand. Whether or not you believe that it's a fantastic metaphor, because Hestia's fire wasn't just heat, it was truth, integrity, a sense that the why mattered more than the what, that cities needed more than stone and soldiers, they needed soul. Let's jump timelines for a second. Picture a Roman villa a few hundred years later. Not Greek anymore, but still steeped in the tradition of a central hearth now under the name of Vesta Hestia's Roman twin. The Vestal virgins are in full swing. Public fires burn. But in private homes, people still gather around flame even if it's now behind tiled walls and fed by coal instead of wood. Some Romans believed that if the home fire ever went out, it could bring misfortune or even death. And they didn't mean that metaphorically. They'd drop everything dinner business love affairs to relight the fire. That's how deep the belief ran. Fire equaled life. and not just survival meaningful life. Life with ritual and rhythm. Historians still argue whether the obsessive fire tending in both Greek and Roman homes was purely religious or had a more psychological basis comfort control routine. But in practice, it didn't really matter. The result was the same. People cared. People noticed. People paid attention to what they were doing around that flame. And that's where we begin to circle toward one of Hestia's most powerful gifts, the idea that ordinary things become sacred when you treat them that way. Think about it. Lighting a fire, boiling water, slicing bread. These aren't dramatic acts, but they're foundational. They're how we survive, how we connect, and when we perform them with presence, they become rituals. They root us. Hestia didn't need temples, because every kitchen was her temple. Every fire pit, every oil lamp, every flicker of warmth in a cold night was a place of devotion. You've probably felt it too. You ever sit with someone and not say much, but still feel like everything's okay? Like the moment is holding space for both of you. That's a hearth moment. You might not have noticed it, but Hestia was there. And in a world constantly trying to pull you outward to buy more scroll, more do more, she's one of the few forces pulling you inward. Not in a selfish way, in a centering way. She reminds you that you don't need to chase Olympus. You just need to tend your flame. Quirky tidbit for the night. In some lesser-known villages, Hestia was believed to watch over not just people, but their dreams. Not in the grand prophetic visions sense, but in the little flickering images that played behind your eyes as you slept beside the fire. One folk story claimed she gathered dreams like embers and saved them so they wouldn't be lost come morning. Isn't that lovely? The idea that your quiet, sleepy thoughts are being held somewhere warm. That every dream you've forgotten might still be glowing in some divine fireplace waiting to be remembered. So, tonight, as your own thoughts scatter like soft sparks, know this, the fire is still burning. You've carried it through every part of your day. Through storms, through doubts, through laughter and emails and traffic and mismatched socks. And now, here you are, tending it by listening, by remembering. You've become part of something ancient, something simple, and utterly magnificently real. You're almost there, just a little further into the quiet. The fire's warmth is a gentle pulse, now steady and soft, like a heartbeat you didn't know you were listening for until it slowed. Tonight, we arrive at the last flicker of our journey, the part where you realize the true power of Hestia's hearth isn't just history or myth, but you. Yes, you. Think about it. The goddess of the hearth was the guardian of domestic life, the silent keeper of peace, the one who held Olympus together. But none of that mattered without the people who tended the flame, the mortals who fed it, who built their lives around it, who found comfort in its glow. Hestia's hearth was cozy because it was alive, because it was the center of daily life, not some distant shrine. It held laughter and tears. It was where children learned to be human, and elders taught stories that stretched back through time like golden threads. It was the first place where love happened and sometimes heartbreak. You've carried her spirit without realizing it. Every time you light a candle to calm your mind, every time you make a cup of tea in the evening, every time you sit quietly, noticing the small details, the flicker of light, the scent of wood smoke, the softness of a blanket. There's a reason so many cultures, ancient and modern, circle around fire. It's a primal pulse, a shared history of survival and hope. And in every crackle, there's a whisper of Hestia reminding you to pause, breathe and be present. Here's a quirky fact to tuck away: some ancient homes had a fireplace spirit, a small household deity who was said to live in the ashes. People would leave tiny offerings of food or drink in the hearth, not just to Hestia, but to these spirits, ensuring they stayed friendly. It's a reminder that the hearth was never just physical. It was spiritual, social, and emotional all at once. Historians still debate the exact nature of these beliefs, but it's clear that the hearth's magic extended beyond the flame. It lived in the relationships and rituals it created. And here's a little truth for you: your own hearth, whatever shape it takes, is sacred. It's a sanctuary carved out in a noisy world. It's a place where you belong to yourself, first and foremost. So, as your eyelids grow heavy and the fire dims into memory, hold this close. The warmth you seek is never far away. It's in the meals you share, the spaces you create, the moments you choose to slow down and simply be. Hestia's gift was never about grand gestures. It was about the quiet power of presence, the unspoken love in tending a flame, and the enduring promise that no matter how chaotic the world becomes, there is always a place you can call home. Now, let that thought be the last ember as you drift off tonight. You are home. You are warmth. You are the hearth. The fire crackles softly one last time as your breath deepens and your body relaxes. The day's noise, the relentless hum of thoughts, all fade into a gentle background buzz, like distant waves caressing a quiet shore. Imagine the slow, steady glow of the hearth. Steady, comforting, timeless, wrapping you in its soft embrace. There's a sweetness in stillness, a kind of peace that's been waiting for you all along, tucked inside the simplest acts. Lighting a candle, sharing a meal, sitting quietly with someone you love, or simply resting your head on a pillow that remembers you. The hearth is not just a place, but a feeling, a sacred pulse beneath the chaos, a gentle reminder that you belong somewhere. That warmth is not just a flicker in the dark, but an enduring light inside you. So tonight, as your thoughts drift like gentle smoke, remember that the story of Hestia's hearth is your story too. A story of care, connection, and the quiet magic in every day. Sleep well. Let the fire guide your dreams. Good night.